Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our special webinar today on quality and risk management challenges when acquiring enterprise systems. This webinar is sponsored by PNSQC, the Pacific Northwest Software Quality Conference, along with the statewide QA program of the state of Oregon. And today we have a special guest speaker, Yingki Kwong, from the statewide QA program. And we're really glad to have him here today. Welcome, Yingki. How are you today?
I am doing very well. Thank you for hosting this.
Great. So let's just carry on. Why don't we go to the next slide?
Uh-oh. That's weird.
I think you can just, there you go. This is myself. I'm going to be doing the moderation today. My name is Philip Liu. I am a volunteer for PNSQC. It's an all-volunteer organization. And I'm on the board as well as the program chair. This is my second year as the program chair. I also have quite a background in software quality as the CEO of XPOsoft, where we do software testing as a service. And I love cycling and travel and going up to Portland and being part of PNSQC. So let's keep going here. Today, before we get started, let me dig into some of the house rules. Nothing out of the ordinary here. The participants are muted except for the speakers. And you can ask questions via the question and answer panel, or you can just type stuff into the chat panel as well. You can also tweet questions as well as comments via our Twitter handle, and we will be answering questions throughout the webinar if we can. And if we can't get to those throughout the webinar or during the webinar, then we will answer them at the end if there's time or via our blog. And don't forget, there will be a recording and we will provide the slides as well. And we'll be sending an information via email on those on that information. Just a couple words about PNSQC. We are the oldest software quality conference, not only in North America, but actually in the world. We're held each year in Portland, Oregon, usually in the first or second week of October. Totally nonprofit organization run by volunteers. And this gives us quite a bit of flexibility in terms of thinking about the topics and the structure of the conference, and we tend to make some changes to the conference based on the feedback from the audience and the attendees. So it really gives us some leeway in terms of keeping our content current with the trends. And one of the trends that we have is that, the industry, there's a lot of QA in vertical industries, which is why we're having this webinar here today. We do have a little bit of uniqueness to our conference in that we have papers, real technical papers that are peer-reviewed, much like an academic conference, but our authors are actually from industry, in practice, working for companies, making software, creating software, and working on increasing the quality. And this is what they come to share at our conference, which is their experience and expertise. Our guest speaker today is Yingki Kwong, and Yingki is from the state of Oregon and acts as he is the statewide QA program manager. He's also an experienced author and speaker with PNSQC. You can see on the title slide there, it says speaker, but actually any speaker at PNSQC is an author as well. So Yingki Kwong has published papers in our proceedings. We do produce proceedings much like an academic conference, but like I said, our papers are all experience and practice-based. And we're really glad to have Yingki Kwong here. Welcome, Yingki. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to borrow your platform today to speak to many of my own colleagues, as well as some folks in the state of Washington and in private industry. Really appreciate the opportunity to kind of redo a presentation that Phil and I gave actually in last October's PNSQC. It was fairly well received at the conference. So there were, most of the room was full of folks, and some of you may recall that earlier in the year, Phil gave a presentation on kind of the general topic of risk management in IT project. One could view this presentation as a elaboration of some of the topics that Phil spoke about earlier in the year. And as part of the follow-on email that we will send out about the recorded presentation today, we can also give information about this previous presentation that Phil gave and I moderated.
Well, why don't you just go ahead and dig in for today, Yingki, and let's...
Will do. Thank you very much. So I am going to talk about IT projects from the point of view of organization that acquire systems. This is a rather different context than a lot of the conferences and meetings about software quality, in that this is from the perspective of the organization that acquires software. For these organizations, a lot of time in what I would refer to as mature industries, government being one of these sectors. The other mature vertical industry would include the usual medical, financial, banking, retail, manufacturing, and so forth. These organizations, some of them might have been around for a long time, and business processes may need to be modernized, and from time to time, there may be a need to change operating models. In government, a lot of time, these operating model change or paradigm change come from new legislation, but also they could come about because of new technology, a new way of doing things, and new needs of customers. So typically, the starting point of all of these IT projects is to be viewed as a kind of investment with a business case. So the business case should typically spell out what are the changes in operating paradigm that an organization may be seeking, the high-level business requirements, solution approaches that may be available, and should end with a specific solution approach chosen and the key success factors and risks. In this type of space, especially with a lot of mature organizations doing systems that are, in many cases, established business needs of an organization, the starting point a lot of time is not a full custom solution, but rather a base system that is possibly commercial off the shelf. Increasingly, they may be software as a service. In government context, a lot of time they may be a transfer system. By this, we mean a system that is transferred from another state that has developed one with very similar feature functions requirement, in this case, the state of Oregon. So a kind of centerpiece of this activities come down to looking at the gaps, a gap analysis. And I'll go into that with a little bit more depth a little bit later on. And the gaps between the as-is state and the to-be state, in essence, define to a great extent the complexity of the overall endeavor. Cost is, of course, an important consideration, and it's important to be reminded that cost is not just the initial acquisition, but also the life cycle costs. Here are some examples of some large IT projects in the state of Oregon. This slide kind of serves as two purposes. One is to show kind of the budget range of these projects. They can range from literally hundreds of millions of dollars to for it to be tracked as a major IT project in the state of Oregon. Typically, they have a budget that's over $1 million. At any one time, there may be 20 such projects that are considered major IT investments. The top 5 currently are as listed here. Interestingly, you will see that the top 5 projects in the state of Oregon, they are all transfer, commercial off the shelf, or SaaS based. One characteristic of this type of system is that the minimally viable product has a pretty large cost, because you're probably acquiring a system because of regulatory requirements and other types of business requirements. The basic system itself have a lot of feature functions and have to work across business functions in an enterprise. This may be rather different than a lot of private sector contexts, as well as small to medium-sized enterprises, where possibly a very small, minimally viable product could be viewed as good enough for fulfilling some important business needs. In a lot of large government projects, the minimally viable product by itself could be a substantial percent of the overall cost. I mentioned earlier the importance of a gap analysis, and there are at least 3 types of gap analysis that one would need to be reminded of. There's, of course, the as is and the to be gap between the current operating model and future operating model. In some of the states' social services type system, historically the state utilizes a kind of caseload model, which is increasingly going to go toward a workload model. This is a kind of sea change in operating paradigm. Many of the state's other major IT projects are kind of transformation of business processes, leveraging technology to reduce manual work or paper-based processes. And then last but not least, from a technological standpoint, what the base system can do in terms of feature functions, and what the to-be system that is needed by the state to meet business requirements. These are among the different types of gap analysis that kind of need to be top of mind for all the people involved in a major IT project engagements. So a quick discussion about lifecycle costs. You know, most of the system used in state government would tend to be delivered by some kind of an integrator, contractor, a lot of time, and in this talk I will refer to them as the prime contractor. That is frequently the most significant cost. Also very significant would be costs associated with hardware, software, networking equipment, telecom circuits, things of that sort. For most major IT projects, for a number of years, there would be dedicated staff for the project, and so the internal staff, both full-time and part-time, should not be neglected, especially when they are federally funded and the cost can be recovered. This next bullet about the supporting contractor is often not well budgeted, and something that we want to go into more details later on in this presentation. In this presentation, some of the italicized bullets are the ones that I think people need to think a little bit more about, because a lot of time they're either neglected or there's not enough resources allocated or not enough thoughts being put in them. In the case of ongoing costs, I think most people would think of the cost of ongoing support and maintenance by a third-party contractor in terms of hosting, in terms of software upgrades and things like that. But also very important in state government is there may be internal operational costs and operation support and maintenance costs, as well as debt services that would need to be accounted for when using bonds or certificate of participation and that type of financial instruments. A very important area to think about is this term technical debt. And technical debt is basically you know, the outcome of a system not perfectly designed and implemented. These include software defects, but also very importantly is less than optimal business function and business processes as a result of not the most perfect implementation. Some technical architecture may be very complex, have a lot of base platforms that create a lot of challenges in configuration management, as well as ongoing support, maintenance, and patching. Most of the state's IT projects start with some sort of a base system with a level of customization. by customization, we basically mean those feature functions that would need to be added. But in addition to that, most of the state systems need to be integrated or interface to a range of existing and legacy systems. And often that is under-resourced. And also very important is the conversion of data in existing system that may be being replaced, and or a variety of shadow systems and databases or spreadsheets that people may be using that would need to be sunset as part of the process of rolling out a new system. Now, the nature of the technical work itself, that can range from simple configuration, scripting, to code development, is not uncommon for a state's major IT projects that is based on a base system, may it be SaaS, commercial off the shelf, or transfer, to have significant amount of custom coding. Kind of my recommendation is when the custom coding exceed 15 to 20%, then one really have to think about whether the base system that's been selected is the most suitable choice to be used as a base system. Frequently neglected is the cost and the resources needed for system integration. So when diverse systems need to interact with each other, some would be the new one being implemented, but also the legacy ones. That work and the resources and time needed cannot be underestimated. Other important consideration, of course, is, as we were saying, this level of customization that might be needed. The big challenge there from a technical standpoint is when you deviate significantly from a base product, especially with commercial off the shelf, you really are bifurcating from the main product, and the ongoing support and maintenance of that become much more challenging. And frequently you need to have special arrangement with the contractor in terms of what would be the ongoing support and maintenance costs, or if possible, of course, to leverage good communication skills to try to get the contractor to incorporate the features, functions needed by an organization as part of the base products going forward. Most systems implemented would need a variety of technical environments. This go from development to testing to training to ultimately in production. And sometimes in testing, you may need multiple environments, some for performance or load testing and some for functional testing. So these are all things that need to be thought through for the needs of the life cycle of a system. Now, from a organization acquiring software, it is very important to understand that the organization's perspective of quality is rather different than the prime contractor. The prime contractor's main concern, and there are some very good contractor out there, but I would say no matter which contractor you're dealing with, one of their main concerns would be their profitability. Of course, their goal is to have as high as possible of profitability. That is not to say they don't want to do a very good job, but they are constrained by the fact that they typically will only do what is in the contract. So meeting business needs from the point of view of the contractor would be rather different than an organization acquiring the software, in that a contractor is unlikely going to do something that is not specifically in the contract. And they would not mind doing whatever might be deemed necessary, but there may be a cost associated with the work. And this type of cost would extend to things such as data conversion and interfaces, because if an interface was not identified early on, or if the data conversion of a data set is not cleansed, likely the contractor, upon having done some work, might want a contract amendment for additional cost. And that's something to keep in mind, is that this escalation of cost can happen due to kind of an improperly defined scope on the one hand, or as sometimes is unavoidable business need that may come up after the contract is signed and therefore was not originally anticipated. So I think this is a good time for a quick word on iterative development and then the use of Agile. I think a lot of organization together with industry folks that feels that the use of iterative development and Agile is a good way to mitigate certain types of risks. And that would in general be true. I personally believe that iterative development is a very good way to help manage risk as well as to deal with requirements that may age and would need to be evolved over time. But the thing to really watch out for when using an iterative development approach and or Agile is that even when an organization plan on requirements to be unstable, a lot of times they would turn out to be even more volatile than anticipated, you know, with business conditions or requirements only properly elaborated once the team members involved can work together and do a kind of organizational level learning to have a kind of deeper appreciation of what the true requirements would be to fulfill business needs. So that's something to be remembered, is that Agile in of itself encourage strong interaction between stakeholders, and that's a very good thing. But just because you have good interaction between stakeholders is not in of itself a guarantee that ambiguity can be removed and uncertainty reduced over time. So where Agile may not be the most optimal, although folks believe that Agile at scale can deal with many of these issues. You know, when you have projects that become very large with many cross-functional teams, and the organization itself may have low maturity with process and tools, and may involve work teams from different geographic areas. These are all challenges for Agile, and so one should not view Agile as an answer to many of the major IT project challenges that are really ultimately traces to organizational complexity and the complexity of the change that is needed. So a quick word on requirements. And these days, requirements may be called different things: user stories, use cases, features. But from my point of view, they are a different way to describe the needed scope. This graphic's a little bit busy on the top there, but what it attempts to illustrate is that the normal project triangle type consideration, by which I mean cost, schedule, and scope requirements. When you have a project with stable business case, stable business needs, the balance of the project triangle come down to a sort of system engineering consideration. That is kind of the left-hand side of the diagram. And the project triangle itself, in terms of the balancing of cost, schedule, and scope, are primarily subjected to a kind of system engineering analysis when the business case and the business requirements are stable. Unfortunately, for many projects, this regime of normal project management really isn't valid. What we have a lot of time, especially when a project involves major paradigm change in terms of operating model, kind of changes to the enterprise architecture, you're trying to move along the maturity models kind of scale and have kind of roadmap that may be very aggressive and may not be all that detailed, is that the business case itself and the business requirement may be subjected to substantial organization dynamics kind of considerations, meaning folks need to work together to figure it out, and hopefully through that conflicts are resolved and people reach consensus. Or unfortunately, a lot of time consensus cannot be reached, and then business case seems to vacillate in of itself, and then requirements had a difficult time reaching stability. Now, when it comes to requirement stability, one really need to pay attention to a variety of risks. Some of those I have mentioned in terms of an organizational learning that would need to take place. But there are also other more mundane kind of challenges. You know, we all understand that we need the participation of subject matter experts, and sometimes for a large organization, the most qualified people, they're so crucially needed by the operations that they may not be available when they're needed. So that's one type of risk. And then the subject matter experts may have a very good feel as to what constitute a necessary customization to meet business needs, but that very much need to be balanced with the trade-off of added technical complexity and cost. And then with that said, sometimes subject matter experts are by definition expert of the as-is business process and the business rules. And the goal of most of these projects, of course, is about refining or improving or otherwise transforming the current business processes and business rules in such a way that may actually makes it very challenging for the subject matter experts to be relied upon without external expertise added. So, other challenges related to subject matter expert would be you have folks that have maybe a good understanding of what needs to be changed, but not necessarily empowered to recommend a good deal of staff roles and responsibility type changes. And then at times we do have issues with kind of the incumbent experts being a bit resistant to change, especially when it comes to workflows and operating models and things of that sort. So that it's very important to involve external expertise as to what constitute current best practices, and perhaps our organizational change experts to work through some of these challenges. Now, most major IT projects occur within organizations that have recognized resource issues. And these kind of resource issues historically would be these kind of boxes with yellow letters, from designing and developing software, system integration, and frequently ongoing support and maintenance of a new technology, and then for folks to be trained up to use the new feature functions and to support the new platforms. Increasingly, some of the activities that may be also outsourced to a prime contractor would include data conversion, analyzing business processes and requirements to see how best they can be improved or transformed. And also project management itself. Business transition is an area, of course, which tied to the need to reorganize staff's roles and responsibilities, and then sometimes external contractors are also involved. A lot of time when a contractor is brought on, one may feel that, well, we're going to have a turnkey support from the contractor in many areas, so the sooner the better we bring the contractor on. Now, that turned out to not necessarily be a correct statement, because an organization needs to have a degree of readiness, and being able to get ready for a major contractor to come on, especially when it comes to staff that would be required to work with the contractor, whether in defining requirements, in joint application development, or working in sprints. I think these are the type of resource planning that needs to be done. And then internal processes to support decision management, review of deliverables and their approval. These are all things that cannot be taken for granted and must have sufficient internal resources in order to make the work of a third-party contractor as efficient and productive as possible. This organization, especially this square box that talks, let's say, internal project management team, is the recommendation of the statewide QA program on the type of resources that a major IT project might need internally in order to work effectively with an external prime contractor. And these type of resources, as you can imagine, falls in these different categories, such as project management, and a lot of times you may need additional contractor support to support the state staff. Other areas would include business analysis to analyze the to be and the S is business workflow. Then there is a need to perform a level of system analysis and, of course, the testing related activities. A project, in order to be ready to work with a third-party contractor productively, really need to have its business case well understood, have a level of planning, and of course, in the process of conducting formal requests for proposals, RFPs, the statement of work, and a level of requirement that can support a good RFP process would be very important. Some of these RFPs that may not have kind of substantial planning and or lack of clarity with the statement of work or requirement may lead to kind of a protracted process during the RFP for these details to be supplied. And at times there would even be vendor protests once the decision is made. A very important thing for an organization to ask, of course, is the lessons learned in similar enterprises. For state government, it's natural to look at other states, especially other states of similar urban-rural mix as Oregon, in the case of the state of Oregon, and or, of course, the population would be similar. If an agile methodology is going to be used by the contractor, then it's very important for the internal staff and its contractor teams to have that background and be able to engage the contractor with a level of understanding of what they might be talking about or doing. This brought us to the importance of the contracting model. As many people know, working in government, the state's preference usually is a deliverable-based approach. To some extent, a deliverable-based would kind of at first sight seem to transfer kind of the cost escalation risk to the contractor. But in practice, of course, what's going on is the contractor has already built that in. So there's the possibility that one would end up paying more with deliverable-based contracts. In the case of federally funded projects, the approval of a contract amendment may take a long time, and so some way to support kind of unexpected need would be helpful, and one way the state deal with that types of needs would be you build in the statement of work and the list of deliverables, certain items that are likely going to be needed under the context of special requests or things of that sort. Not all the attorneys are necessarily supportive of that approach, but that business need nevertheless is there, especially for federally funded projects with the long turnaround for contract amendments. When it comes to the statement of work, I already said earlier, there should be a level of details and requirement. This idea of a well-defined acceptance criteria is useful in two ways. One is it level set expectations between the acquiring organization and the contractor, but also, per this earlier slide about the motivation for the contractor, anything that's not stated or anticipated in the contract likely would lead to cost escalation. In iterative development, you have these sprints as depicted in this circle in the middle of the diagram here. One of the important characteristics of Agile is this backlog. And the backlog is where I believe a lot of risks are when it comes to using Agile in government, to the extent that the backlog can be elaborated with good details in terms of scope and resources needed. That would lead to good use of Agile. But if this backlog is not somehow managed well, and or the work products produced during a particular sprint is not subjected to a level of review and testing, one could actually have unquantified risks as the project progresses, and that's not a good thing. So when it comes to contracting, you know, I think it's very important to build in the contract requirements around.
Hey, Yingki, a question came in just now, and
Yes.
they're wondering about that in terms of waterfall, agile, and contracting, and how agile works in contracting, because usually in the contract you say the system must do X, Y, and Z, but then in agile, you know, you're working each iteration and picking out requirements as they come out from the backlog. So how is that handled?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's kind of tailor-made for this specific slide. A big challenge of Agile a lot of time is the statement of work and contract templates are really based on a waterfall mentality. And if this top diagram here, one anticipate all the sprints kind of fit in this long diagram in an amorphous kind of way. And the contract simply call out a combination of detail requirements, design, and then at some point you have a big software release that can be tested. And when that is not actually what is going on within the work of the contractor's development lifecycle, then there's a level of incongruence, and that leads to a lot of problems. In order for this to work effectively, the recommendation from the statewide procurement program is that one must look at the iterations, the sprints, or a collection of them as having well-defined input, which are the requirements and the design, and then well-defined output, which are testable code, whereby the state or the acquiring organization can develop specific test scripts and test results. And in saying this, what we're really saying is that the statement of work and the state's templates must anticipate phases or major software releases that in essence is an overlay of a waterfall-like structure on top of the sprints or iterations. And this is that lower diagram here. And some of us in the office of the state CIO over time developed this term we call itterfall. You know, itterfall is kind of like a play in words between iterative and waterfall. And I think this is one way to deal with this potential incongruency issue between a contracting model and the use of iterative agile model. And I'm afraid to say that if the contract is waterfall-like and one put agile sprints into it, like into this long rectangular box in the top diagram, then one is likely going to have major problems. And the major problem comes in the fact that, in essence, the detail requirements, the design, these things that may be needed to develop test cases would not be available until very late in the process. And that could present major challenges in the testing and in the verification and validation of everything involved. And then that leads to kind of a good segue into the, I have to thank my colleague Jack for coming up with this acronym and the visual for this. You know, this term business aware testing is from my co-author and presenter, Phil. He thinks one of the very important aspects of verification and validation is for the people involved in checking out the work delivered by the contractor to utilize a kind of business aware way of testing, you know, this BAT. And, you know, one have to view from the perspective of the acquiring organization that ultimately there are a variety of different types of testing that would be needed, functional testing, non-functional testing, and then types of testing might include like accessibility testing, security testing, data conversion testing. And it's very important for these type of testing to be slotted, you know, into different phases of the project, especially when you get close to the delivery of a total system, that you start thinking in terms of the kind of tests you might need to do before UAT, the kind of tests you need to do during UAT and pilot before you get to the enterprise-wide rollout.
Yingki, we do have a question that came in. I think it's appropriate at when we're talking about the UAT and exit criteria.
Yeah.
It's from one of the person in the audience is asking, should each iteration have a sign off? You know, typically the project manager wants to control all the communication in the project with the project steering committee, and the steering body needs to listen to and support the PM. Does this put the two roles in conflict, and what should a PM do to make the best of the situation?
Right. Let's go back to the kind of waterfall description of waterfall-like structures on top of sprints or collection of sprints. If the contract spelled out major phases or software releases, then those are actual deliverables that would require a level of sign-off. You know, because at the very least, the state would have to acknowledge that it meets certain acceptance criteria, and that maybe as a result of delivering a sort of intermediate deliverable, that they may even get progress payment and things of that sort. With that said, a intermediate deliverable can be a collection of multiple sprints, and not every sprint would need to have that level of rigor. So I think this ultimately comes down to a kind of business decision between the project's management, agency management, and the contracting folks involved, DOJ attorneys consultation in working with the contractor to kind of right size the level of rigor when it comes to deliverable acceptance. And I think some of the very important aspects besides talking about overlay of sign off and approval and review on the sprints is when you get to these kind of major milestones that has to do with system integration testing, user acceptance testing. There should be kind of well-defined exit and entry criteria. And one shouldn't really exit SIT testing or UAT testing until the number of defects has been reduced to what is contractually required. And I think these are among the kind of practices that can be used, you know, for this waterfall model. You may have a kind of mini acceptance testing for a subset of the overall features functions that are being delivered in a software release, you know. And I think these are all things that require forethought and discussion, and it's very important to not kind of just lump them all together as that big long rectangle that I was depicting earlier. This is kind of an interesting slide, and it go back to work that I've done with some of my procurement and DOJ colleagues, that there are going to be times when you want to make sure that the system as delivered has certain empirical trending when it comes to time series of defects. And here's an example. You know, one might take some specific set of test cases and have it be run multiple times over time, and make sure that the defect counts reaches a peak and start falling. And this type of view of the empirical defect trend, I believe, ought to be incorporated, if not in the contract itself, then as part of the software metrics for guiding if a system is ready for pilot, and if a system is ready for statewide rollout. You know, unfortunately, there are times, you know, with political pressure and business needs, there's kind of a motivation to release software perhaps earlier than it should be, and these things all typically become other types of risks, you know, and kind of disappointment in the user community, disappointment in stakeholders among citizens or user groups, and I think these are not easy decisions, and by no means agencies, management, or organizations management intentionally roll out a system that's not ready or anything like that. It's just a lot of times the systematic characterization of this type of empirical trend is not there, and one really have to plan for this type of thing in terms of having the time and the resources available to check a system as defects are repaired. And this is kind of go back to Phil's notion of a BAT, business-centric view of testing. Now come to the final couple of slides. I think it goes without saying that many of the states' system, as well as any large enterprise, the project amounts to a complex coordination of a number of things. And these complex coordination, among other things, would include the governance around the changes that may well be needed with business function over time, and how the different business functions need to work together end to end. As organizational learning is typically needed for people to have a better feel over time as to what the requirements truly are, or the details truly are, the process, the elaboration typically can be guided by better roadmaps. If there's not a good maturity model that tell you how you can get from, say, the current level of maturity to a newer level of maturity, then one need to have some kind of roadmap whereby the cross-functional teams can be aligned. And the cross-functional teams, in terms of their work and the dependencies across different functions, I think these are among the toughest challenges in any complex system projects, not just software system projects, but really any complex hardware, software systems. So I think these kind of things is very much something that should consider in any type of system development lifecycle approach. So now to get to the conclusion, I think there are many facets of quality when considering enterprise systems. We talk about requirements. We're talking about understanding the nature of the investment in terms of the need to transform operating models or significantly streamline business processes. There is a need for the acquiring organization to understand that their motivation may well be different from their prime contractor. The development life cycle, whereas is a very important thing, is neither the answer or the issues or everything. I think some of the more complex issue has to do with the complex coordination between different functions, and to kind of elaborate as systematically as possible what the future state of the system and the business operation would need to look like. That type of envisioning exercise really take a significant coordination, as well as a need for different stakeholders to reach consensus rather than kind of being stuck in turmoil. And the ability for the different team to do the right work in the right way at the right time is a very challenging thing. I think a lot of the folks that utilize the Agile methodology and referring to the Agile manifesto, there's some very good ideas there, in terms of how people need to work together closely. But to assume that everybody can just dynamically and organically come together to deliver good work is a bit idealistic, and really require significant checks and balances and coordination along the way. So these type of challenges that, as I said, ultimately require an organization to have a sort of culture of quality around organizational learning, developing a common language to communicate the magnitude of change, the nature of the transformation that's being undertaken, and to recognize whether the work being done has a kind of dominant design or maturity model that can guide you, or one can best have a kind of high-level roadmap that must be elaborated more carefully with consensus developed along the way. So kind of my parting caution for everyone working in Agile is that Agile is great in terms of the need to deal with ambiguity, but if all the ambiguity is stuck in the backlog, then you just have unquantified schedule, budget, and resources kind of risk. And that, of course, does not lead to the normal expectation that with as the project progresses and good project management apply, that you have reduction of risks. It's very important that we, recognize that an unmanaged backlog actually is a kind of blowing up of risk as time goes on. And
that's interesting. We have a question that came in about that just now.
Okay.
Yingki is from Ben, and Ben says, do you recommend penalties in a contract if the contractor doesn't perform to the performance standards outlined in the contract? And I guess that would have to do with, the scope and features and stuff that's in the backlog, right? So
yes, penalty clauses are not commonly used in the state of Oregon contracts, but it has been used. An example is the e-government program that when it was transitioning from one contractor to the current one, there were some penalty clauses built in. Maybe it wasn't called penalty clauses, but it was stated that if the state fulfill all its obligations in this transition process and the contractor is not ready, then the contractor have to pay for the work of the current contractor being replaced. And these are things that can be considered, but they may be much more applicable in support and maintenance type contract as opposed to development contract. The challenges with development contract is it is sometimes very difficult to show that the responsibility reside entirely with the contractor. And there is a place for penalty clauses, and that's much more common in the private sector. I think this is an area that can use a lot of teamwork between the state's IT community, procurement community, and DOJ.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a buyer and you're buying something and you don't get what you want, then you want a penalty, right?
Yeah. That's a very good point. I mean, enterprise system is not something you can just take back to your Home Depot to return. So
you told me I was going to get air conditioning.
So this turned out to be a topic that Phil and I will write a paper together with some of our current colleagues, Jack and maybe others, and we would want to be inviting anybody that's interested to come to the conference and look for the paper related to software-based disruptive change.
Well, thank you. I think that's it for now. I don't see any more questions, but I will add a little bit of context here in that, in terms of, I know that you've been mentioning contractor. You've used this word contractor a lot, which is common in, I guess you could say, the government field in terms of buying software or buying software services from a quote unquote contractor. But when you think about it, Salesforce or SAP, they build software and they are contractors to a lot of companies where they have to go in and modify their software or provide services around their software to make it work for who their customer is. And, when you think about it, a power utility company, they don't go out and develop and hire 200 developers to develop their billing system, right? So they actually have to go out and find a contractor who has a billing system, who's willing to work with them to modify the billing system according to the utilities needs or the water company and so on. And the same thing would go with, for instance, a bank that wants to have an accounting system or HR system that's not, if you're not Bank of America, you don't build your own system, right? So
and I would submit even the Bank of America likely these days will not develop their own system for HR, for example. Of course
right. Sure.
They may well have a need to develop their own system where developing that system would give them the competitive advantage. You know, maybe like a
Right.
proprietary trading system, for example. You know, and in government areas where many agencies would do sort of similar acquisitions would be areas such as electronic document management, licensing system, because there are many agencies, board and commission that would need to license folks. Turns out even licensing systems are not necessarily that similar. You know, it's very different to license a driver's license versus the license that a physician may need to practice medicine. And
Right.
so our sister state in Washington State have more centralization with their licensing, and in Oregon they're much more distributed. And I think there are always kind of interesting to see how different states or large enterprises address some of these similar needs in all enterprises. You know, and they are typically accounting, HR, you know, payroll, you know, those type of things. And then the state of Oregon is in the midst of implementing an HR, HRIS. And I think there's kind of a trend away from implementing a single solution vendor for all of these disparate functions that may be needed in a large enterprise ERP system. Gartner actually used this term that was kind of interesting. They call it postmodern ERP.
Right.
And the postmodern really means that you use specialist system and worry about the system integration as the new specialist systems are being implemented in specific functional areas. That of course put even greater challenges to the IT community in terms of how best to deal with the different disparate systems from the point of view of data conversion and integration and interfaces and things of that sort.
Right. So, yeah, thanks for being here with us today, Yingki. I think that your government context is really part of a smaller market or smaller term in terms of enterprise, because there could be many different industries where government is just one of them. You know, it could be the banking industry or power utility industry or any type of company that really buys software and that they don't want to develop themselves, and you know the typical SaaS offering just doesn't quite fit them, right? So they have to have software modified for them. So this is really interesting. Why don't we try to close up here as we have a couple more minutes left for the webinar.
Well, thank you very much for everybody's participation. And
can you go to the next slide? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, thanks for being here. So just as a note, the webinar has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel and via SlideShare. We are opening the conference this year with an inaugural, I guess you could call it event, but it's really the Government and Enterprise IT Forum. Government as well as enterprise, large enterprises, like I said, banks, utility companies, any company has to acquire software and have it modified for them. You know, I've given quite a few examples today. And, you know, they can be used for estimation and budget, HR, things like that we've talked about. And we're going to be sending out a survey to the participants today, as well as our PNSQC community, on the types of issues that we're going to be discussing within our forum at the conference this year. So the forum is not quite well defined in terms of how we're going to organize the events, but it will be something like a manager's workshop where we have the participants get together and the forum will be facilitated, and we're going to organize it such that problems are discussed and hopefully we'll all be able to come up with solutions together. So watch for the survey in your email for the types of issues and questions and problems that you're facing that you want to have us discuss in the forum. And thanks for attending, everyone. We're at our time limit now, and thanks very much. So thanks very much, Yingki. We'll see you at the conference. All righty. Thanks.
Bye-bye.